Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome to CSIS for our discussion of the hidden costs of cybercrime, the fourth in a series of reports we've done on this. We're lucky today to be joined by some real experts. Let me do the run of show and then we'll give their bios. The keynote will be given by Grant Schneider, who's the Senior Director at Cybersecurity Services at Venable. Previously, as you all know, he was the Federal Chief Information Security Officer at the White House and out of the NSC. Prior to that, he was at DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, for many years. Steve Grobman, who we've had many times before, is the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of McAfee. He's the author of numerous books and papers and holds 30 patents, which is pretty amazing, Steve. He leads the development of next generation cyber defense and data science technologies and threat and vulnerability research. He's spent more than 2 decades prior to McAfee in senior leadership positions related to cybersecurity. Finally, we're really grateful that Jonathan Holmes, who's the supervisory special agent at the FBI Cyber Division's Major Crimes Unit, is joining us. He assists in ransomware cases and helps develop the FBI strategy to combat ransomware. I think that's going to be one of the big topics today, is what to do about ransomware. Prior to serving at headquarters, he investigated national security and cyber crimes, both in FBI and Los Angeles, and also served for a time in Bulgaria, which is probably a great way to get insight into what's going on in cybercrime. With that, let me turn it over to Grant to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me today. I want to thank CSIS and McAfee for all the work that you put into this report, and really also for continuing to do this over time. I'm a big fan of data, and I think being able to see trends is really helpful and really important, even when those trends are kind of frightful. And as we're going to talk about this year's report, I think there's some frightful things in there. And you know, I also really like the concept of highlighting for people and having a dialogue around, you know, what you don't normally or maybe necessarily think about as some of the costs associated with cybercrime upfront. And, you know, as I read the report, a lot of things, actually all of the things, I think there's about 9 different areas that are listed of, you know, hidden costs, if you will, associated with cybercrime. Over the last 5 years, I've had the opportunity to be involved with every major incident inside the federal government that we were responding to. And, you know, all of the things I would say on the list and in the report really resonated with me as things that we encountered. And I would say, you know, when I first started kind of in that role, many of them were hidden to me. They all slowly revealed themselves over time. And I want to hit on a couple of them. One of the things, though, that I think in the report that stood out to me is that 95% of the respondents, 95%, said that they had been the victim of some form of a cyber incident or had some form of a cyber incident in 2019. And that's just you know, obviously that's almost everyone. Now, I'm sure some of those are really big, some of those are really small. You know, cyber events, you know, I used to always say in the government, you know, the year we had the OPM breach, which was a very significant one, you know, it was one of 50,000 events, right? And so there were a whole bunch of other ones, but they may have been much, much smaller. The fact of the matter is that most people are going to encounter a cyber incident in some way, shape, or form. And so when we talk about, what is the impact on an organization? What does it mean to an organization? I think the things you initially think of, are, the systems may be down for some period of time, either because you're going to pull them offline proactively, or the malicious actor has actually rendered them inoperable. And then what does that mean from a productivity? What does the potential loss of customer data mean? What are the costs associated with loss of customer data? When I worked on the OPM incident, and for those of you that I imagine most people are familiar, probably many of you got a letter from OPM as a result of that incident, but 21 million people's background investigation files were accessed and taken from OPM. And, just the cost of identity theft protection monitoring associated with that was $1 billion over 10 years. Right, and for an organization that had a couple $100 million budget per year, if you're looking at 3 times their budget over a 10-year period, a significant amount of cost. And that was just, that wasn't replacing a computer, that wasn't a single forensics person showing up, that was just identity theft monitoring for a 10-year period, which I think OPM originally targeted a 3-year period, and Congress extended that to 10 years. So significant costs, significant unexpected costs there. But a couple of them that I wanted to talk to, really all of the things associated with a cyber incident go to your brand image, right? And brand image, perception is reality, and perception is especially reality when it comes to your brand and what is it that you as an organization, and it can be a public organization or a private organization, but having the brand of what are you bringing, and are you bringing a sense of trust, that customers trust doing business with you, trust for, in giving you their personal information, their sensitive information, their financial information, whatever those things are, having a brand and being known for that brand is something that, is very hard to recover from, and also very costly to recover from. And for those of you in private industry are certainly aware, marketing campaigns are expensive, and marketing campaigns, when you're trying to, overturn a perception or a negative brand, are really, they're really important, but they are also very, very costly. I also want to talk a little bit about the whole concept of outside assistance, and this comes through in the paper of, if you have a cyber incident, you're going to bring in experts. You're going to need to bring in experts. You're going to want to bring in experts, and I absolutely recommend it. However, outside experts get expensive, and they certainly are going to spend a lot of time after an incident. And another one of those are, the potential of, long-term litigation costs. And I now work at a law firm, so I have a little more exposure there. We all perceive lawyers as expensive. Long-term litigations are certainly going to be expensive. Going back to the OPM breach, which was over 5 years ago now, I, as recently when I was in the government as last spring, got called in to conversations with the OPM and DOJ lawyers because they're still in court cases about the OPM breach. And so those are costs that are just continuing to exist and continuing to endure in that one incident. I don't know whether the government's going to ever tally up all the costs associated with that. My guess is probably not, but I am confident that a multi-year litigation is going to be very expensive and very costly for an organization. Another one that I thought was really, really important in the paper and not often talked about is the damage to employee morale. And employee morale is so critical to everything we do in whatever organization we're in. Leadership always talks about our most important asset is our people, is our workforce. And that's absolutely the case, because that's where the creativity comes into an organization. That's where development happens. That's where innovation happens. And yet, cybercrime isn't often thought of like other crimes, but a criminal activity or criminal act is a traumatic experience for an individual. Whether you are just in an accident, whether you're mugged, whatever you're the victim of, but being the victim of a criminal act is traumatic. And victims, and if you're in an organization that was a victim, you're still going to have the feelings. It's not like just the head of the organization is going to have those feelings of, impacting their morale. But the types of feelings that people will have is, they may be angry. People will feel violated. They'll feel vulnerable. Like, we don't know how to prevent this. We don't know what to do in the future. They could get timid and want to be less innovative and less proactive in the things they may do. They also might feel guilty. Right? One thing with cybercrime, I think we often treat victims not as victims, but we treat them more as the cause of the issue, right? If you're the person that clicked on a link and it caused a big issue, you're rarely treated as a victim. You're often treated as the criminal, or as, someone who, what did you do to allow this to happen, right? That's often the types of questions that come into minds, as opposed to thinking about, hey, our whole workforce is going through a traumatic event. Our whole workforce has been victimized, and how do we start the healing from that perspective? And that's something I've seen in the government as well, especially on really high profile. Clearly there's often, some turnover, be it self-selection or not self-selection. But I think understanding, how your workforce is reacting and taking care of your workforce so that you can rebound as an organization is absolutely critical. I think what all of these hidden costs do is they pose an existential threat to an organization if you have a major cyber incident, right? It is something that is absolutely could, basically make your organization go away, make it cease to exist. Whether that's a public organization or a private organization, it can have that big of an impact. So a couple thoughts on what does this mean for industry leaders? What does it mean for government leaders? First and foremost, you should expect some form of cyber incident while you're in charge in some way, shape, or form. And I think the most important thing is really focusing on preparation, right? And preparation in a couple forms. One, you want to try to, take a risk management approach, right? And I highly recommend looking at the NIST risk management framework: identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. 5 pretty simple terms that really cover the waterfront on what you need to do when it comes to cybersecurity. But part of that prevention is trying to, or preparation is trying to prevent a cyber incident in the first place. Make sure you've got your due diligence, that you're patching, that you are doing all the things the cyber experts will tell you up front. But another part, and I think this is also something that often doesn't get done, organizations invest a lot in trying to prevent, is preparing for a response and preparing for a recovery, having an incident response plan, having an incident recovery plan, understanding, what does that mean, and what is the team going to look like in your organization that you're going to pull together. And the paper talks about this as well. This is not the IT department's job, and it's not the legal department's job. You need to bring in HR. We talked about the workforce. You need to have IT there. You need to have your legal team there, but you need senior leadership. You need your customer engagement team. You need all the different players at the table. And if the first time they're getting together to think about cyber is in the middle of an incident, you're just going to be well behind the power curve at that point. So in addition to having a plan and pulling it together, exercising, doing some tabletop exercises, and being able to really walk through, well, how would we respond? Would we want to go public? Would we want to pay a ransom? Would we want to engage law enforcement? And just to think through in some hypotheticals what that will start to look like will, help you be better prepared. It will also decrease the trauma for the people who you need in response mode in the event that you have an incident and you need to work through it. One of the things I see now, and I saw this in government and certainly see it now in my role, is the ability to work with clients and really, we do incident response. I've done a fair amount of that in the just couple months since I left government as well. But I really want to be ahead of it. I want to help companies, prepare for the incident, ideally prevent it, but be sure that they're prepared for when it happens, because it's just become, unfortunately, too common. I think anything we can do to prevent cybercrime in general, we need to do. I look forward to the panel discussion to talk through some of those things. But my bottom line for leaders, private or public sector, is really around preparation, taking that step up front. Those costs are going to pale in comparison to incident response and recovery costs. And I think they're absolutely worthwhile investments, and they also have the likelihood and I think will decrease those costs if you do find yourself in a response and recovery mode. So Jim, with that, I'll turn it back to you. Really excited to be part of the discussion today. Again, thank you to you. Steve, thanks to you and McAfee for pulling this together. It's a great product for us to really have this dialogue.
Thanks, Grant. That was really a great overview, and it's a good start to this. What we're going to do now is have Jana Maklo-Smith, who's a senior CSIS associate and a professor at the Air War College, give us an overview of the report, since she was the principal author. So Jana, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon. We'd like to first offer up a special thank you to everyone who helped contribute to our fourth report on the global cost of cybercrime. Against the backdrop of a global pandemic, this report was indeed a teamwork tour de force. Now, it's no secret that cybercrime harms public safety, undermines national security, and weakens economic health. But what is less well known, however, are the hidden costs. As you can see here on the slides, that is what distinguishes our 2020 report from the previous in our series, Understanding the Hidden Costs. Our goal was to provide analysis and insight on those costs that organizations may not even be aware of, like opportunity costs, harm to employee morale, which you heard about earlier, and incident response costs. In general, the time that institutions spend responding to and recovering from attacks is unfortunately an overlooked area. But this study helps illuminate that, enabling decision makers in companies and in government agencies with insight into why and where they should invest their efforts to protecting the organization. For example, our survey showed that the average interruption to an institution's operations was 18 hours. And the average cost for the most expensive incident was more than $500,000. Now in 2018, CSIS and McAfee estimated that cybercrime costs the global economy more than $600 billion. Today, we estimate the cost has grown to $1 trillion. That's more than a 50% increase in 2 years. Now, using the model developed from our previous reports, we estimate the monetary loss from cybercrime at $945 billion. Now, combine that figure with the global spending on cybersecurity, which is projected to exceed $145 billion in 2020, and this is now a $1 trillion burden. So what accounts for this increase? There are several factors. One, there's more data available because more countries and organizations are now reporting cybercrime. The second, although cyber law enforcement techniques have improved, cybercriminals are ever adaptive in leveraging new technologies for nefarious purposes. For example, using synthetically generated media such as deepfakes, photos, and AI-enabled voice phishing for illicit gain. In terms of the big picture trends, we observed an increase in ransomware and phishing schemes since 2018, and that cybercriminals are increasingly targeting a broad swath of targets, such as pharmaceutical and medical research companies, academia, and even local governments. But beyond this trillion-dollar headline, it's important to bear in mind the following. Cybercrime and the efforts that we take to mitigate it tell a story. And it's a story that reflects back at us a curious image of human nature. Not simply that theft is timeless, but it's a story of when expectations and reality just don't match. And what do we mean by that? Now, it's undisputed that cybercrime is undesirable, it's expensive, and it's disruptive to organizations. In fact, almost all of the organizations we surveyed that experienced an IT security incident said that the costs went beyond monetary loss. The biggest losses here being diminished productivity and lost work hours. However, of the 1,500 company executives we surveyed from across the world, only slightly more than half of those organizations said they did not have any plans to prevent and respond to a security incident. And that's striking. Further, of the 951 organizations that did have a response plan, just 32% said it was actually effective. That's why our report reveals a deeper story about the gap between expectations and reality and highlights what steps need to be taken. Overall, we found a lack of organization-wide understanding of cyber risk. On a more uplifting note, based on our analysis, our report recommends 2 areas for decision makers to concentrate their efforts on. The first is developing prevention and response plans, and you heard a little bit about that earlier. The second is improving communication. Speaking to the first point, only 44% of the survey respondents said that they had plans to both prevent and respond to IT security incidents. Further, only 32% of the respondents viewed their organization's plans as completely successful. And although 62% considered these plans somewhat successful, it speaks to additional room for improvement here. To the second point, lack of user knowledge is a root cause of success in many of these security incidents. Communication between departments is key to ensuring that employees understand the causes and preventative measures that should be taken to safeguard both themselves and the organization. Now, in this final slide, we offer several best practices on how the organization can enhance their cybersecurity posture. Let's quickly walk through these. First, implementing basic security measures across the board. Think layering defense systems with multi-factor authentication. Second, increasing transparency within organizations to promote communication. Again, the need for improving communication was a reoccurring pattern in our 2020 findings. Third, promoting the standardization and coordination of internal cybersecurity requirements. Fourth, providing information security awareness and training to employees. And lastly, developing prevention and response plans. Again, this was another core theme that emerged from our survey. And with that, that concludes our overview of the report on the hidden costs of cybercrime. Next up, we look forward to opening the expert panel and discussion. Thank you for your time. Over to you, Jim.
Great, thank you, Jana. That was tremendous. You got through it all in less time than you were allotted. Rarely get to say that. So we're now going to our panel, which, as I said before, is Steve Grobman, CTO and Senior SVP at McAfee, Jonathan Holmes, Supervisory Special Agent at the Cybercrimes Division, Major Crimes Unit at FBI, and then Grant will join us again for the panel. Grant may have to leave a bit early, depends how talky we are. Steve, you've been doing this for a while now. Why don't you give us your views first? What do you think's going on? Where do you see the areas of improvement? Did anything surprise you out of this report? What are you working on? So, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. You know, unfortunately, the report didn't surprise me in the takeaways. The quantitative impact is a staggering number. You know, at the end of the day, the CSIS report shows us cybercrime pays. The statistics, they're alarming. Attacks are impacting the global GDP by hundreds of billions of dollars. And, you know, you really call out that the severity and frequency of cyber attacks continue to rise as the attack techniques evolve. New technologies are broadening the threat surface, so we expect that that's going to expand into all of these different environments. Right? Cyber criminals are able to operate in countries around the world. They can cross geographic boundaries with little intervention from local law enforcement. And one thing I found fascinating is the report called out that some scenarios, governments are actively encouraging or even actively participating in cybercrime. So organizations of all forms are finding new levels of efficiency and productivity by using technology such as cloud. And when we adopt these technologies, adversaries are going to find new opportunities for exploitation. What the report really calls out is that we've built our modern infrastructure and GDP around a high-tech world, and cyber criminals are profiting immensely from that system. It's industries outside the tech sector that are continuing to expand their reliance on technology, really to stay competitive in their global economy. The report calls out significant deficiencies in how these organizations secure their environments, and that's what's creating these opportunities for cyber criminals. It's important to look at that in addition to the increase in how we're using technology, it's also how organizations are accessing the technology. Now, this year, as the pandemic was growing, we saw a mass migration to remote work. And much of our workforce is now working on consumer devices, home networks. It's these softer targets that are appealing to cyber criminals looking to gain a foothold into an organization's network. It's also the lethality of attacks. The lethality is increasing. We're seeing more attacks where adversaries are using human-machine teaming. Leveraging latest offensive cyber techniques, a human attacker is able to make strategic decisions where to best target the attack and maximize pain for an organization. Contrast that with traditional attacks that relied on mass distribution and luck in order to hit the high-value targets. It was just a few years ago, we were seeing attacks on devices or systems, whereas now we're seeing attacks on organizations. And there's a human on the other side of the wire, which makes it really difficult for defenders because they don't know all of the places within their organization that might have been impacted. And because the scope of the breach is unclear, it drives organizations to have a much more in-depth and therefore expensive investigation in order to gain that confidence that they've successfully remediated it. So let's talk about what I've been thinking about we need to do to better defend against this growing threat. I think Grant called it out really well that it's important for organizations to plan for both protection and response. And even with the best defended organizations, there will be those scenarios where an attack or breach is going to be successful. So when we think about investment, we have to think about protection, detection, and correction or remediation in all of our cyber defense plans. Now, every organization must also ensure that they have the right cost-effective, scalable security solutions. And part of this means that it's comprehensive, including defense in newer areas, newer technologies, such as cloud or cloud edge. And with the explosive growth of shadow IT, it's important that we recognize cybersecurity isn't just the IT and security team, but it's all of our responsibility. It's every group within an organization. And from a policy standpoint, there's a lot we can do. Cybercrime can't be tolerated by any government. And nation states must agree to not engage in theft of intellectual property or commercial trade secrets. The bottom line from my standpoint, and I can't wait to have this discussion with the panelists, is cybercrime is a high growth, profitable business, and it's going to continue to grow and flourish unless we make foundational changes in the way we fight it.
Great. Thank you, Steve. That was great. I'm going to turn to Jonathan now and say, you've seen this now at all levels. What do you think the big trends are? Why do you explain the rapid evolution in cybercrime that you've had to deal with? So what's the FBI thinking about when it comes to this topic?
Sure. So some of the trends that we've seen in ransomware, at least, or I'm sorry, in cybercrime over the last few years, is absolutely ransomware. Just an explosion over the last year in ransomware, but other crimes as well, right? We continue to see business email compromise as being a trend that is not going away. We're continuing to see more and more cryptocurrency theft, more and more data breaches. Again, continuing to see theft of IPR, whether that's economic espionage. Like, again, these things are only going to increase because it is so valuable for these cyber criminals. With respect to ransomware, we're seeing the trends with many cyber criminals to move towards that crime, because again, that's where the money is. The trend here for ransomware is we've seen ransom demands now increase into the tens of millions of dollars range. And so we see that many of these criminals are talking to one another and saying, you know what, this old model of going after banking credentials and focusing on bank accounts, that's just not as lucrative as doing something like ransomware. Similarly, we're continuing to see these high dollar payouts with BEC cases as well. So I think Steve is 1,000% correct. None of this is going away. This is so lucrative for these cyber criminals that we really have to get our heads around how to fight it at every single level.
Great, thank you. Let me invite everyone. I'll start with Grant, but one thing that's come up a lot is ransomware. And so when we started doing this cybercrime series, I don't think we even had the word ransomware in the first report, right? And it's become a growth industry. It's become the way that criminals easily monetize what they're doing. So let me ask all of you, and Jonna, please feel free to jump in when we get there. Grant, what do you do now with ransomware? What did you do with ransomware when you were CISO in the federal government?
Yeah, ransomware is really, I mean, again, as we've said, cybercrime unfortunately pays, and for the victims, I mean, if you look at and I think you talked about this one in the paper, if you look at the city of Baltimore that had a ransomware attack, and I don't remember what the ransom was. It was a fair amount of money, but not a ton of money, and I'm sure Zana or someone remembers, but the cost they calculated to recover was $17 million. It was so multiple times more than what the ransom was. And so the question is, for them would be, from a business standpoint, should we have just paid the ransom? One thing though that, and Steve alluded to this, the vast majority of cyber incidents, and I think all of the cyber incidents that I've been, responded to, came in through a known vulnerability that had an existing patch or mitigation known as well. And so, we think about 0 days and really creative and what are nation states doing to get after us. But quite frankly, cybercrime for the criminals and ransomware, it's easy because you just need someone to have not patched a vulnerability. And Steve talked about the fact that cyber criminals are always at your front door online, right? There aren't good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. We're all in the same space. And so they can find someone who has a vulnerability and find it very, very quickly and search across thousands. So the likelihood of them being able to find a victim is really, really, high for them. And it's really hard to prosecute. It's really hard to track them down. And the motivation for a lot of organizations and the incentive is unfortunately going to be to pay. And we're seeing more and more companies that are asking, how do I think about ransomware before I get there? What do I need to be thinking through to make, to potentially make a payment decision? I think there are things we can do on the prevention side. I don't think just telling everyone don't pay is going to get us there, because the business incentive for some is going to unfortunately be to pay, although I'd love for us to have that attitude. I think we've got to find more innovative ways to really get after what this looks like and what the solutions are.
Great, thank you, Grant. Steve, do you want to talk about ransomware? It's you've been watching this for a while, and it didn't come out of nowhere, but it came up really quickly.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think about with ransomware is, from the cyber criminal perspective, it's almost the perfect crime. It's incredibly efficient in that the victim is paying the cyber criminal directly. So there's not all of this overhead associated with how do you digitally fence stolen data? How do you profit from your crime? I think the other big thing that I've given a lot of thought to around ransomware is how it's evolved in the last few years. When we first saw ransomware, probably 5-6 years ago, it started impacting consumers where it would encrypt your MP3 files when people actually had MP3 files and hold them for ransom. And they would want, $100, $200 of Bitcoin to get your music back. Today, ransomware has evolved to hold anything that a cyber criminal can extort an organization for money around. And that means that clearly holding data for hostage with traditional encryption keys is still something we see, but it also means taking manufacturing systems offline and holding a factory for hostage. It means stealing intellectual property and threatening to post it on the internet unless a ransom is paid. It means taking embarrassing emails out of specific employees' breached email environments and threatening to post that information. So one of the things that we need to give a lot of thought to in order to fight ransomware is how can we take some of the incentives out of it and make it more difficult for the adversaries to profit? And that's going to be incredibly difficult, but part of it is going to be around making the costs higher for them to do those initial incursions. So if we look at cybercrime is a business, if we can raise the cost to the cyber criminals on the OpEx side, that forces them to reinvest the dollars and the investment they would make on executing ransomware on researching ways to overcome those barriers. So what all of us can do together is figure out how do we put speed bumps in the road to challenge the economics of ransomware, but think of making it more expensive to the cyber criminal.
Great, thank you. Jana, did you want to add something on what we'd seen in the report on ransomware?
Yes, thank you, Jim. Hopefully this isn't throwing an apple of discord into the discussion forum, but in our survey, we found that IT decision makers in government are less likely to report that data breaches represent the highest cost for their organization and are more likely to say that ransomware, phishing, and malicious insider attacks represented the higher cost, which may reflect an unintended consequence of the Federal Information Security Management Act, known as FISMA. And under FISMA, federal agencies may be inadvertently incentivized here to report security incidents in such a way that it would not harm their overall FISMA compliance score. FISMA requires each federal agency to develop information security plans and reports and submit them to CISA for review as well as OBM. But the penalties for a low or a failing FISMA score include censure by Congress, negative publicity from the agency, and reduced federal funding. Data breaches are expressly mentioned in FISMA and trigger notification and reporting requirements. But in contrast, ransomware and phishing are not expressly mentioned in the Act.
Great, thank you. I'm happy about phishing because I just got an email today from a former commander of Central Command telling me would I be willing to help him move his illicit gains from Iraq to a bank in Europe. I know the guy, I don't think it was him, but Grant, we'll come back to you. Do you want to say anything really quick on the FISMA point, which we thought was really interesting? It's a sort of perverse incentive.
Yeah, I think there are certainly opportunities in FISMA to get more granularity around incident reporting, right? If you read the annual FISMA report, last year it was something around 35,000 incidents across the federal space, and some of those could have been phishing, some of those could have been ransomware. But the way those get reported is very much kind of up to the agency. Yes, agencies are, we think they're going to report the best data they have. Of course, reporting that data gets you beat up potentially by GAO and the Hill and maybe leadership. So the incentive structures are admittedly a little difficult there, but I think it's really, how do we get to where we're leveraging the data to get after the things Steve talked about, which is how do we change the calculus for the malicious actor, for the cyber criminal, and therefore everyone is viewing this data as not fodder for some overseer to come beat me up, but actually, you know, fodder for all of us to be able to help solve the problem more holistically.
Jonathan, you're one of the real experts on ransomware. So do you want to tell us what you might want to think about this? What would FBI recommend to someone when it comes to ransomware? What is it you actually do in these cases?
Well, for ransomware, let's start with the reporting aspect. Like, we are absolutely pro-reporting, right? We want people to be reporting to us because those are the leads in our investigations. The virtual currency addresses you provide, the indicators of compromise that are provided to us, all of those are leads that enable our investigations to move forward. What is I think your other question is, you know, what is the FBI doing in this space, at least as it relates to ransomware? Our strategy revolves around like three main thrusts, right? It's one, to hold these actors accountable. So do what the FBI tries to do best, is identify where these people are located, bring charges against them, and try and ultimately bring them to justice. Second main prong would be to target the ecosystem in which they operate, right? So it's not just going after the ransomware actors, it's going after the ecosystem that helps them. It's the shady exchanges that they rely on. It's the money mules that they rely on. It's other malware that they rely on, right? Many ransomware variants rely on other types of malware, whether that's TrickBot or Emotet or Dridex or whatever. So we're going after, like, we're looking at these ransomware cases holistically. Like it's not just the actors that have their hands on the keyboard. It's the money mules that are helping them. It's the other malware variants that are supporting them. Looking at that entire ecosystem. And then the third sort of thrust behind our strategy is the outreach and the education, doing talks like this, making private industry aware of the threat, trying to make them as prepared as we can with the threat, and just to foot stomp something that was mentioned earlier, just about surrounding, you know, outreach with talking to people about basic cyber hygiene. I think that is a real concern on our side, is that I think with respect to ransomware, it seems as though these actors have more victims than they can deal with. So it is not a concern that they need more victims. It's the speed at which they can victimize people is the speed at which they can do the lateral movement across a victim's network and deploy the ransomware. So that's generally what we're doing to try and combat the ransomware threat.
Great, that was really helpful. Why don't all of you give us real quickly, what would you tell a company when it comes to these kind of cyber threats? What would you say, here's what you should do? So we'll come back to this topic because it's a big one. Basic cyber hygiene, always a good place to start. Steve, you said you weren't surprised at the outcome. I was a little surprised that so few companies, almost half the companies, don't even have a plan. And how long have we been talking about this? So what would you tell them? Grant, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. So, you know, it's a long list of things you would tell them to do, certainly, but just having a conversation in advance, right? If you're a CEO, if you're in the C-suite, reaching out to your technologist and engaging in a conversation that's around what is our risk profile? What steps have we taken? What have we thought about? I mean, just having that dialogue, I think will start to peel back some of the layers of the basics. Have we done the basics? Have we put those things in place? Because they're absolutely critical to, you know, because they increase the cost to an actor to go after you and your company. Now, unfortunately, they move on to someone else. It's like, you know, eventually you'll find an unlocked door in the neighborhood. And the cyber world, the criminals can check the locks really quickly and really remotely. But for your own organization, doing some due diligence, doing some preparation, and having it not just be, oh, the IT guy, some guy in the basement's thinking about this and keeping us all safe. There's no such place as safe. It's a team sport. It's everyone in the organization just having a bit of a culture around security. And then one other thing I would mention is understanding everywhere you have a relationship with a service provider, what are you on the hook to do from a security standpoint, and what are they on the hook to do? Because I do see organizations who sort of do the, I've gone to the cloud, I'm good, I must be secure because some cloud provider is going to take care of it for me. But really, and this is where your legal department and your acquisition folks can help you dig into those arrangements so you understand and everyone knows what the expectations are.
Great. That's a great point on cloud. Steve, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is critical is for organizations to triage what their unrecoverable vulnerabilities might be. So as bad as ransomware is, there's many ransomware scenarios where you go through the event and you're back up and running, regardless of whether it's data being held for ransom that you can either recover from a backup or in those fringe scenarios where possibly even pay. There's another part of the report that talked about IP theft. And one of the challenges with IP theft is it's really not recoverable. So if you have a foreign actor that steals IP and the laws of their country make it such that they're practically going to be able to use that intellectual property to compete against you, that's a much stronger long-term impact. So recognizing that having different levels of security controls across your environment and identifying and inventorying those areas that, if they were to be lost, would have not only high impact, but would have long-term impact, and put zero trust, principles of least privilege around those areas is one of the most important things that organizations can do. The other quick add-on I'll add, kind of building off of this concept of security is a team sport and it's not just IT or the security teams, tremendous benefit in tabletop exercises where you get teams outside of the IT organization working through scenarios, even if they're hypothetical, before something happens for real. So having the executive team understand how the different players in an organization would operate during a data breach or during a system being held for ransom is a key type of exercise that, when it happens for real, will put the organization in a much better spot.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, we can't do an event anymore at CSIS without saying the word COVID. So what's changed for you as a result of COVID? And everyone else can chime in after this, but is your job changed? Is it still the same? Do you see more? What's going on here?
Well, I mean, as we said, cybercrime's not going away. We definitely saw with the advent of COVID, we definitely saw some new cybercrimes, I guess, pop up on the scene. One of those would be fraud against the Paycheck Protection Program, right? So people getting money fraudulently that way. We've seen, actors that were based in West Africa that are typically, doing BEC type scams, definitely gravitating towards Paycheck Protection Program stuff to try and steal money that way. In the larger cybercrime sphere, we've seen lots of phishing emails that are COVID themed, right? So it's not particularly targeting hospitals. It's just they're sending phishing emails that are associated with things that are news of the day. And one example of that is I know Emotet, malware variant I mentioned earlier, sending phishing related emails. One other trend that we saw, just because it's ransomware and it's near and dear to my heart, is although ransomware is not new, one thing that I thought was interesting that we saw from COVID is many ransomware variants publicly stating that if they targeted if a hospital was hit with their particular variant and that was unknown to them, that they would provide decryption keys for free. Now, I wish that was the case across the board for all ransomware. Unfortunately, it is not. But I thought that was at least an interesting trend of among thieves, there's maybe a little bit of honor left. So I thought that was interesting to highlight as well.
Great. That's kind of the only time I felt envy so far in doing this was the guy who used his payroll protection money to buy a Lamborghini. That's impressive. But let's end with a final question here, which is one of the things that, again, surprised me in the report is the lack of organization-wide understanding of cyber risk. And that's one of the reasons we may not be doing as well. So let me ask each of you for the audiences that you might have a lot of experience with. Jonathan, and let me say what they are and then we'll go down the list. Jonathan, when you think about juries or when you think about the governments you've worked with, not only in the US, but elsewhere, when you think about the corporations you visit, what's the language there for explaining risk? Grant, when you think both about your new corporate customers, but also your long experience with government agencies, and more importantly, with political leaders, what was the issue there in communicating risk to them? Jana, you are embedded in the military now. What do you see on the military side? And finally, Steve, one thing that I guess there's been a little progress, but we'll save you for last on this one. But the C-suite and the boards still aren't entirely there. They're much better than they used to be. But maybe I could go with each of you and we could conclude on this note. The lack of an organization-wide understanding on cyber risk. What is it we would need to do about that? And think about the audiences you have expertise and experience with. Jonathan, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So, I mean, when I've talked with organizations surrounding cyber risk, whether that's public or private industry, it's a lot of what we've already talked about today. It's protecting your computer systems, ensuring those systems are secure, having some sort of policy in place, right? Making sure you have incident response plans, protecting those incident response plans. So it's mitigating that risk to your business or to your municipality or to your government by protecting those computer systems. Separately, when we're having discussions with other law enforcement partners, whether those are inside or outside the United States, we talk about the prosecution of individuals and imposing risk and consequences on our adversaries, on these cyber criminals. And so the risk that goes towards those criminals that we can impose is cost, is doing those things that I mentioned earlier by targeting them with prosecution, targeting them in other ways by going after the ecosystem that makes them profitable and allows them to operate. And the risk that sometimes we talk about with foreign law enforcement is, what is the risk surrounding not going after these individuals? So if we're having conversations with countries that could be doing a better job, let's say, in bringing some of these criminals to justice, it's the risk surrounding allowing these individuals to operate. And so those are generally the conversations that we have across the board, at least from our side of the house.
Great, thank you. Grant, when you had to brief political leaders, when you had to brief agency heads, what was the reaction? Did you feel like they had a good grasp of this, the potential for risk? And some of them did, some of them didn't. What were the variables that affected that?
I would say we've seen it evolve in a good way over time, right? But pre 2015, I would say in general, cyber and IT again was something that was a little mysterious and scary, and senior leadership just had less exposure to. I think as we have more and more digital natives, if you will, entering the leadership ranks, they at least understand it better. But one of the things we really have to do, IT people often are not great at translating IT risk into mission and business risk, or really communicating, with the mission side. And we have to be able to do that. Because if I'm a CIO and I say, oh, all our email may go down, right? Half the organization's going to think that's a good thing. Half of them are going to think it's a bad thing. But our ability to really put it in terms of what does this mean and what can I do about it? After OPM, secretaries and deputy secretaries, and in this administration as well, we're very aware of that's bad and I don't want it to happen and I need to do stuff about it. But I think they were not necessarily comfortable on what those steps were. And senior leaders, political leaders often like to be in charge and in control. And this is an area where they really don't necessarily have that control. So I think you have to, talk to them that it's okay. They don't need to have control of the situation. However, they need to have an awareness and an understanding of what's happening, and they need to have a team that can talk to them and bring them options that talk about mission impact, not just talk about, do I turn the server off or not? It's really, what does that mean? What are the second and third order impacts, both from a technology and mission delivery, and then all the other sort of hidden costs that we talked about with the paper, as far as brand and reputation, and what is this gonna mean? So, being able to put cyber into context and into a context that's gonna resonate with those leaders, I think that's one of the biggest challenges is just making that translation and getting the right people that can do that for you.
Great. Jana, you're involved in training 05s and 06s. It's new for you, but quickly, what's the reaction to them? How much do you think they grasp the risk we're facing here?
Certainly.
06 is a kernel for the audience. Most of you know that. So.
Well, two parts to that. First, in the military, October is focused on Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So that month is used to help educate service members of all ranks about basic good cybersecurity hygiene. Secondly, going more to the academic standpoint on this, one of our partners on the report, Duke University's Office of Information Technology, their Stinger project, which is a collective threat intelligence project, they observed some interesting trends around COVID-19 and malicious IP requests. Specifically, once the pandemic began impacting higher education in March and April 2020, the Stinger project observed an initial decline in unique malicious IP addresses as faculty and students moved to more remote learning or working mode. And what was interesting about that, Duke hypothesized that the decline was due either to a reduction of systems on the participating networks once faculty moved to a more remote learning scenario, and also a switch in tactics from actors coming from Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to target home workers and learners via phishing or other social engineering attacks. Earlier, Jonathan had mentioned business email compromise in our discussion of best practices. One valuable best practice that I've seen applied here in the academic setting is having a function on your Microsoft Outlook that you can report suspicious emails, essentially a report a phish email option to help flag to your organization, is this a legitimate email request? Does my supervisor really want me to buy those iTunes gift cards? So again, having that communication channel is important and one of the core themes that emerged from our report.
And Grant, I know you may have to drop out in a couple minutes, but stay on as long as you can. If you have to drop out in the middle, thanks for doing this. Let's give the final word to Steve, because one of them, I don't know if it was this report or a previous one, we found that the best way to focus an organization's attention was to get the C-suite and the board to look at it. So and you've been doing this for a while, you work in those circles. What is it you've seen? What's the trend going on for understanding risk?
Yeah, I think one of the discussions that every organization needs to have with the C-suite is a data-based discussion on risk. Humans are really bad at correctly predicting the impact of different types of risk. It's why people are scared of snakes, sharks, and bears when they really shouldn't be, but we have a global pandemic and nobody saw it coming. If you look at the digital equivalent, recognizing that low frequency, high impact events can and do occur, and making sure that an organization is prepared so that when your organization has one of those rarer high impact events, it doesn't become a company ender, it doesn't become a country ender. And getting the right balance between the daily blocking and tackling of the pedestrian high scale threats while preparing for those less common events is what risk management is all about. And having that discussion at all levels of the organization is absolutely critical.
Have you seen a change in attitudes at the C-suite level? I mean, a few years ago, it was sort of news to them, the way Grant was talking about, this isn't a place they're comfortable in. What have you seen?
I think a little bit, but I think as we see in other areas, there's short-term memory. Whenever there's a major industry event, so when there's Equifax or Anthem, for a few months following that, there's a very heightened level of alertness and awareness. But over time, there's distractions, and it seems like we recalibrate back to norm. So I think there is more and more awareness overall, but it's something that having a quarterly or biannual discussion with the C-suite on cyber risk is a good practice that really makes it so that it's part of running the business.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of our allotted time. Let me ask Jonathan or Jana, any final thoughts or remarks? We'll give Steve a chance to say bye, but Jonathan, anything you'd want to leave the audience with?
Nothing, just a foot stomp. The cybercrime is not going away, as evidenced by this report. These trends are going to continue to rise, and it's going to continue to be a problem. And we really need a whole community effort here to try and mitigate some of this. And other than that, I would say just thank you everyone for your time today. I appreciate being here.
Great, thank you. Jana, any quick closing remarks?
I second everything that Jonathan has said. The two emerging themes from our report: develop prevention and response plans and improve communication. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve, what are you working on these days? That can be the final comment. What's your biggest challenge?
So much of what I'm focused on is how we're using the next generation of technology to detect threats that we haven't seen, very aggressively using AI to look at all sorts of new threats, whether it's cloud or threats that are outside of traditional malware. And it's important to understand that getting that right balance between threat intelligence to detect the threats we've seen, but also being able to detect the things we haven't seen is all part of a strong cyber defense. And that's so much of what my day job is.
That's a good note to end on. So let me thank everyone for tuning in. We will have this available online for those of you who would want to refer back to it. And of course, it'll be on our website. So Jonathan, Jana, Steve, thank you very much for participating. Thank you.